I'm Kevin Davis. This is the Catholic Family Podcast, and my doppelganger over here, Andrew, is joining me for a show today. It was pretty funny. We turned on the cameras. It's like, hey, you're wearing the same thing I
Oh,
am.
in the middle.
Exactly. We did not plan this. Maybe our wives secretly did, but I don't think so. I'm
Yeah,
pretty sure
we
that
were
didn't
talking
happen.
about
Sometimes it's just how it is. And last time I matched with Andrew's wife. So I guess, as we said, great minds think alike. Anyway,
Yep.
Andrew's on today. This is going to be a really interesting show. And it's one that's one of my pet, what's the pet topics, I suppose. And that is talking about patriotism, talking about the love of country, talking about how do we love our country. And that's what Andrew's here to join us to talk about. Kind of, how do Catholics act as patriots? What is the best way to do that? We've covered this in certain ways in the past. We had years ago, we talked about patriotism versus nationalism, and the
Yep.
church actually has pretty clear definitions on both. And Andrew again is here to join us. He's active duty Army. Andrew, first of all, thank you for your service, and I think that's going to help also. Maybe give us a little bit of a perspective of someone who is currently serving our country. And he's also done a lot of research, talked to clergy about this as well, because we both agree that this is a very important topic. And it's one, again, that the Catholic Church also says is very important. The patriotism is a virtue. Thus, it has to have an opposite, right? And if it's not a virtue, the opposite, of course, is it's a vice. So Andrew, where do you want to begin with this? What is patriotism, I suppose?
Well, first, thank you for having me on. As always, it's an honor to be on the California podcast. Last time talking about Crusader Filmworks, this time talking about something I believe is really important, as you mentioned about being patriotic, especially in these days when it's very difficult. We know about a bunch of psyops, we know about unjust wars, we know about how bad things appear. So it comes across as if someone were to love their country, which has done great evils, are we supporting those great evils? And I think you and me both agree that there is an answer to that question. But I can start off with what St. Thomas Aquinas says about patriotism. His quote is: "The reverence given to our country includes both homage to all our fellow citizens and to all the friends of our country." So, basing it off of what St. Thomas Aquinas just said, clearly, how you said, it is a virtue. And I believe I was reading a little bit of moral theology about it, talking about how it's a virtue out of the fourth and fifth commandment. One to honor our elders, our fatherland, and then one to defend that nation off of the fifth commandment. But going into the broader topic about that virtue, it actually is also derives from piety. So one's reverence and love to one's nation symbol, long as it's not inherently evil, which our flag is not. Stars and stripes represent the states, and then obviously the 13 colonies.
Real quickly, so I just want to mention real quickly with the flag, because that's a great point, because many flags in Europe are, I don't know, I want to say evil, but the three banded colors, the three colors in a row, are absolutely, they come straight from the French Revolution. It is absolutely bad. So many European flags, not all of them, but
Yeah.
Germany, Belgium, Italy, Ireland, many of them since the French Revolution have become like that, and that is certainly worse than the American flag. But anyway, sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. And, as the progression of our country from the beginning of the flag and how it's gone, and all that's really changed is the number of stars on the flag. Well, we should be grateful that our flag hasn't been changed into something, the pentagram, the Baphomet, or the
Yeah.
hammer and sickle, all these different things. Like communism has been condemned, whereas a constitutional republic has not, which again, we'll go into a little bit later because everyone believes that we're a democracy. But the founding fathers were very clear on the fact that we are ruled by the law, constitutional republic, not ruled by the majority. There are other resources I can give if anyone would like to know more about that. But really, I've come here to answer the question of how can a Catholic be patriotic in a corrupt nation? I titled my outline "The Catholic Patriot" because I do think it's very, very important. And it's actually fitting that we were supposed to record this podcast on Flag Day, which
Yeah.
so I'm driving home from work to record it over lunch. I saw all these flags, and I'm like, this is pretty awesome to see it, kind of giving me a little bit more patriotism as I go into this podcast. But honestly, it's been good to wait a little longer so I can formulate this outline better. But yeah, I think I can answer it within four points if you want to begin.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think we both have looked through, gotten a few quotes. I've got a nice Chesterton quote. You've gotten some as well, and I think that's it's important going into this. I mean, before we get started, that I think everyone needs to. I think this is, in a way, a critique of some people. People who are just
Yeah.
always negative, always pessimistic, always down, always hating the country. But I think it again, if you're watching this, please don't just go away. Don't say, "Oh, we're sick of hearing this," because I think this is a really important topic. Again, I think it really does matter, and we're going to try to back that up with quotes from the church and quotes from some of our current pastors, our current clergy, and
Yeah.
hopefully that will just hopefully drive home this idea again that at least think about this again. Don't just go home. If you watch this video, don't just go home after and be like, no, I'm not, la 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 la. I'm just gonna still hate my
Yeah.
country. So at least think about it. So let's go ahead. I mean, where do we begin?
Yeah. Well, also, just real quick, a response to what you just said, to all those people who think like that, I want to just tell you that I've also thought like that. There were times when I was driving, to and from my job, and I would see an American flag, and I would just think about all the things that it's done that was, are evil. The unjust wars, the teaming up with communist countries, the issue of the Civil War, the issue of conflict, the issue of politics, the issues of the St. Patrick's Battalion, the anti-Catholic mentality that this country did have and still does have. And I was starting to get disgusted with the flag, and I started to really think, yeah, maybe we shouldn't do anything with it. But it started to really irk at me, because if we are to think that way, then we must leave. We have to find a better option. We're called to be patriotic. We're called to love our fatherland, and a lot of people will sit there and say, "I won't wave the American flag. I don't want to show any respect to this nation because of all the evil it's done." But then they don't leave. They still benefit off of the highways that have been built. They still work for American corporations. They're still American, and it starts to become almost a like the political version of the Home Alone issue, where we recognize that there's something really bad is happening, but we can't do anything about it. And it's just kind of like it's just time for the Antichrist to come, and then that's it. Which I really think is really, really damaging to our mentality. I've met other people, even non-Catholics, some Protestants who have this same mentality, and all they do is soak up the negativity with no Catholic action. And as Catholics, we should be the front. We should hold on to our nation's flag. Right next to it, we need to put above it the Catholic flag. They know we claim this nation. We step out of the way and we let the forces of Antichrist, which are the globalists, they don't want nations at all or any kind of national pride. That way they can enshrine the one world government. If nobody cares about their nations, then it's very easy for the Antichrist to be the seat over all the world. So we need to stand in above that. I think I can answer a little bit of it here. Going into my first point, if you got nothing to say, I'll go right
Okay.
into it.
Yep.
Okay. So in section one, I'm going to go over America and its origins. So the founding fathers made it possible for the faith to flourish later on. Even though those principles are not Catholic principles, such as, the federal government will have, essentially no say over what state has what religion, they were very hands off. And in that time, that was a huge deal for our faith. And just like as St. Paul says, where sin abounds, grace abounds more. God saw this, he used it as a way to, oh, you don't want to establish any religion? Okay, well, I'm going to open the door to allow my church to flourish in this nation. I'm also going to go over in the beginning, our revolution was not the same as the French or even the Mexican Revolution. They were basically taking away the Catholic authority. It's much worse for our nation to be Catholic and then lose it, whereas America wasn't. It was run by Protestants. Not even saying it was necessarily a just war or anything. I don't know enough about the issue on the Revolutionary War. I want to do more research, but all I'm going to say is that we have to paint it within context. Some people will say French Revolution, and then they'll put American Revolution on the same level. Well, we know that's not true. We didn't have any executions of Our Lady or the Sacred Heart of Jesus statues, and there was no anti-Catholic revolution. It was anti-Protestant, anti the authority of England. Also, we got to say that Washington was neutral. The French did help us in our revolution, but they called for our aid in their revolution, and Washington said,
Yeah.
no, we got to be
No.
neutral.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. No,
Yeah.
it's fascinating, and it's fascinating as you say that if you look at just shortly after the revolution, Napoleon came along, and
Yes.
Napoleon conquered most of Europe and absolutely put pressure on the Catholic Church, and I mean, shut down churches. They took all of the land, took all of the money, the wealth that the church had accumulated,
Yeah.
and gave it to, to Napoleon, gave it to the state, and absolutely secularized things. So again, you're exactly right, that it's like people always just demonize America from the revolution, from its founding. It's like, well, yeah, but it's not that. It's not that simple. And again, I'm sure you're going to get into this. Okay, or they talk about, okay, freedom of speech. These are things that are against the church. It's like, yes, that's true. Absolutely. Do we both wish that America had been founded on Catholic principles, Catholic morality? Of course we do. I mean, no, but you can't just then go and say, well, since it wasn't, it's evil. What would you
Yeah.
rather be in the mid 1800s, or let's say 1820? Would you rather be in France or in America as a Catholic? So don't which was one of the first Catholic countries, right, in Europe. It was the first Catholic country in Europe. So
Yes.
let's calm down a little bit about this. And I think that that's another thing, that it's one of these kind of points people kind of shoot out of their pistols, that, oh, I hate America because of the Constitution. It's like, yeah, come on, I don't know, it's not that simple.
And honestly, going off what you just said, Bishop Sanborn has a really good video on his channel talking about the separation between church and the state, where Stephen Heiner asked him some questions that you brought up very, very well right there, talking about the issues of the Constitution. And he said, well, the reason why it's not as bad as people make it out to be is because these are limitations on the federal government. These were not limitations on the state. So there could, like, if Maryland wanted to become Catholic during that time, they could have done it. They could have said, we are a Catholic state. And I believe that they did
I think they
at
did.
that
Yeah.
time. So, and technically to this day, states could do that. They could say, if Texas converted and said, "Hey, we're going to become a Catholic nation," they may have some issues when it comes to like outlawing, other, because of the whole pursuit of happiness issue, and they might argue that that's a pursuit of happiness, but they could tolerate it and they could still become Catholic. So it's a limitation on the federal government, but it's not a limitation on the states. Which again, that's what the mentality was from the founding fathers. We need to put a bottom up type thing where the people are really in charge. Then you have the state to represent people. Then you have the federal government to represent everything else. And it's not supposed to be federal, state, then people in the bottom, which is what we see now, because we'll get into it a little bit later, the issue of the corporation of America that seeks to destroy the defenders of freedom, and they want to enshrine tyranny. But again, Washington was neutral, and I do believe that's an issue now. We're not very neutral for the
Hmm.
past at least a century.
Oh,
And
I mean,
yeah,
to get into the downside of things, yeah, we've been a terrible country for a century. There's no
yes,
question about that. In terms of what we have done, far, outside of our own country, yeah, we've started wars a few dozen times. No question. We assassinate people, dropped nuclear bombs in the most Catholic cities in Japan. We have
yes,
been we again. It's not that simple. But our government, our military arm, whatever you want to call them, the people making these decisions have made horrible decisions.
yeah,
Again, we both agree on that. That's not the point.
yeah,
That's true. There's no denying it. We're not closing our eyes and saying, "Oh, our leadership is amazing." No, they're not. Haven't been
yeah.
for a long.
And I think I might have made a mistake by saying "we" because
Yeah, I do
that's
too.
one issue.
Yeah.
And I'm so used to doing it. I'm so used to saying "we" this, but the true countrymen of the United States of America, we are not for abortion. We are not for unjust wars. Again, Washington was neutral. That's not even a Catholic, and he was, so a real American should be against going overseas and getting into foreign affairs that don't involve us, especially in a time right now when our nation is in one of the, I would say it's in the worst positions it's ever been. But yes, we are the United States of America countrymen. Then you have the corporation that seeks to do things like that, drop nuclear bombs on the most Catholic countries to get to the point where they would love to outlaw all of Christianity. So that's why I think it's better for us to not say we, because we, the people, are for the fight against tyranny. That's what our nation was supposed to be for. And while it was built on some sloppy principles and obviously Masonic principles too, you can still be proud and show a lot of love toward your fatherland and say, no, I stand with the founding fathers. I stand with the Catholic Church against tyranny, because the Catholic Church is also against tyranny. And the only one universal power there is the Catholic Church. There is no nation. The Antichrist will come and he'll claim the whole thing and pretend to be a universal power when he really is not. But to go on a little bit longer, Washington was neutral, did not want to help France. The rebellion was against Protestant British, who were very violent and very anti Catholic. So after the Constitution was written, America became a beacon of hope that allowed for Catholic immigrants, Irish, Italian, to come here. So if America was so bad, then why would all these Catholics rush to come here and then pave the way for all of these cathedrals, the Catholic culture that was here? And obviously, Vatican II brought a huge end to that. They were
Absolutely.
persecuted too. Uh, People will often say, "Oh yeah, the Italians and the Irish were persecuted, I guess because they're Italian and Irish," but that wasn't the sentiment. The sentiment was these are papists, and I'll get into that later on from the St. Patrick's Battalion in the Mexican American War, which again was an unjust war. But to continue, I'll get into that a little bit later. I want to just stay on the topic of the origins. The first Catholic bishop was Bishop Carroll. When he came here, actually, the founding fathers went to Rome or they spoke to them, they sent letters and said, "Hey, we would actually think that Bishop Carroll would be a good person to send here." But they told him, "Hey, we're a hands-off government, so if you don't have to send him if you don't want to. Our government is supposed to be hands-off." But they did end up sending Bishop Carroll, who did a lot of good. For instance, Henry Knox was the Secretary of War, which now is called the Secretary of Defense because it sounds better, even though back then they were way less warmongers than now. But he went to Washington and said, "We have some natives in the West who are they're angry and they want war." And he suggested to Washington, he said, "Maybe we should send some missionaries over there." Imagine that. This is a government petitioning for Christian missionaries. So Bishop Carroll wrote to Washington and said, "I have priests ready to go. If you want, I will send these priests." And then Washington said, "Now may not be the best time because they're on the warpath, but I'll keep it into consideration." Later on, Congress paid for those priests to go out there in the West for years on end and paid for the priests to evangelize and to baptize those natives. So
Just
again, anti-Catholic, if it was truly that anti-Catholic, and if Washington was a devout Luciferian, then he would have never ever sent Catholic missionaries to baptize these natives.
well, and it's a great point that you bring up. Him being a Masonic, George Washington, and many of the founders were. That again, no denying it. That's true, and that's not good. But it was very different than what we see it as now. Now it's you're kind of high roller, kind of Luciferian secret society. And back then it was founded in 1717, and it was already kind of this good old boys club, but it, at least from what I wasn't there. I guess I don't know how secret and dark they were, but it doesn't seem the case that back then it was 50 years old. It was kind of this new thing. It was kind of cool that they're trying to do
Yeah,
these symbolic, but it was humanist. It was much more humanistic than satanistic, and I think that again, not saying that's good, but it's
no,
certainly better. So the view we have of Freemasons now doesn't necessarily connect to what it was then. I think again that's the important
yeah,
point. So people are always like, "Well, George Washington was a Freemason." It's like, yeah, he was, but it's not the same. You can't just say things like that.
no.
That's not. It doesn't equate.
And off of what you just said, there's only reports of Washington going to a Masonic lodge only two times in his life. First to be initiated, and then the second time for some other occasion. So the kind of Mason we're dealing with, even in that time, where honestly, your average Americans now, like your average conservative American, that's kind of what they were back then. They were just you know, for human rights, they weren't necessarily Luciferian yet. That happened very obviously later on when Pike came around and said, "Yeah, we have a god and his name is Lucifer, the light bearer." But back then, it wasn't it wasn't like that. And also, Washington, out of all the founding fathers, was written to be the most honest. He was written to be a genuinely good person. So he a Mason? Yes. Was he a Catholic? There are some reports that he converted on his deathbed. I certainly hope so. I don't know how real
Mhm.
that is. There are also reports that Our Lady appeared to him at one point in Valley Forge, and it's a really interesting story.
Hmm.
Again, no one's bound to believe it, but it is super interesting. I just read it today. But yeah, so the founding of our nation was certainly not what it is now. Some people will say it's ran by Masons now. It was ran by Masons then. But the whole idea is that back then, what they stood for is absolutely against what the Masons are doing now. They would not be friends. They would be fighting because one is for a hands off government, one is for tyranny. So they literally are fighting for two different principles. Yes, the revolution fought against authority, they fought against the British, which again, that's a controversial topic because revolutions are mostly condemned, right? Because you can't just overthrow authority. But in that situation, it was different, and we can't sit there and say Revolutionary War of America and the French Revolution, they're basically the same thing. They're not the same thing at all. And again, the mentality of Washington and Congress paying for priests to go evangelize is a huge deal. My second point I want to get into, this is probably the biggest thing. I never truly heard anyone go over this from the Catholic perspective, so I hope I can represent the argument pretty well. Is the corporation of America versus the United States of America, the real America. The nation's founding obviously wasn't perfect, but it was way better than what we have today.
Hmm.
And essentially, that statement right there is a way for me to get into the issue of the corporation. And I think the best way to start will be with an analogy. We, as Sedevacantists, as true Catholics, we recognize that the Novus Ordo pretends to be the Catholic Church, but it really isn't. Just like Sister Lucy, you have a real Sister Lucy, and then later on you have a fake one pretending to be that. The way I see the issue of people who say I can't support the nation because of all the evil it's done is to blame the real nation for the evils of the corporation, the imposter nation that just stole the flag and says, "Hey, we're America, and we are for, we're going to say we're democracy, even though we're not. We're supposed to be constitutional republic," and they're going to lie again because we're not even a democracy. We're a communist oligarchy, and they pretend that we have an option. They pretend that we have all this say. They try to say, "Hey, we're a democracy," and then people will say, "No, the true nation is a constitutional republic. You're lying to us." Just like how they lied to us with Sister Lucy, just like how they lied to us with the anti-popes. Even though, hey, look, it looks like it's Catholic. They have the flag, they have our buildings. They say they're Catholic, but they're not. The same thing is true for our nation. And the symbol of the nation, which I'm going to get into later, the flag, and they make it out to be the symbol of the corporation, which is why I think a lot of people say, "I won't rain the flag," because they think there's only one nation. Just like if someone were to come to you and say, "I can't trust Sister Lucy. She's hugging the anti-popes. She's all for Vatican II. Something's wrong. She must have been a bad person or lost the faith." In reality, there was a real Sister Lucy that they done away with, and they put an imposter, which I believe is what happened to our nation. People debate when this happened. Most people would say this happened at the end of the Civil War. Essentially, that while that war was certainly a punishment, all wars are a punishment, as Our Lady said at Fatima. But after the Civil War, as a punishment for slavery, essentially all citizens of America became slaves, and the states lost a lot of their rights. So,
But Abraham Lincoln was a great man, Andrew. He was the best president ever. That's actually we could talk about that probably for a
yeah,
whole other podcast. But that's another thing that I think again people really should look into. Look into Abraham Lincoln because public schools, the History Channel, everyone will tell you over and over and over that Lincoln is the greatest president of all time, or maybe second. Not a chance. He is almost bottom three. I'd say Woodrow Wilson's probably my number one worst president. I think Lincoln's maybe two. I mean, and I think because exactly he broke a lot of what America actually stood for, which was state power and I
yeah,
mean habeas corpus, a lot of different things that he did. But anyway, we'll talk about that some other time. Pretty interesting and but don't trust what people tell you about Lincoln. That's for sure.
definitely not. I mean, I'm sure everyone, it's very easy to find his quotes on slavery. I'm going to butcher, I don't have his quote exact, but he basically said that I'm for the Union, whether slaves are in there or not. I don't care about the slaves. I care about keeping the Union together. And the Confederates, they want to leave. Again, I'm not for slavery, nor are you,
Right.
nor how the
Right.
church. Read Exodus. You'll find out how quickly God is against slavery. This is why I believe the war actually happened. I do believe that it was a punishment for slavery. But was Lincoln against it? No, he was definitely not our solution. The solution was the people praying and converting to the Catholic faith and then actually setting free their slaves. Certainly, that's an evil thing. And the only good thing that came out of the Civil War was the freedom of slaves. But obviously, you can understand the mentality because people of African descent were not treated well right after. It wasn't the Union. You go to the Union, you're treated good. I mean, look at Abraham Lincoln. He certainly was a member of the Corporation of America. He did not want to lose power. He needed to create America to be a superpower, and that's why he didn't care about the slaves. He cared about the resources that the South had. Anyway, my point on the corporation essentially is that the real nation stands for freedom and stands against tyranny, whereas a corporation stands for tyranny. And there's so many examples. People, I don't even think I gotta tell people that, convince them of that. People who usually see all that say, "Look, this is a reason why I don't want to support America because of all of that stuff that the corporation has done." with the symbol of our flag. So just as Sister Lucy goes around and kisses the hands of the fake popes, the corporation does the same thing, and then it has our nation's flag, which does so much damage to the real, perception of the nation.
And it's something I've studied recently, a little bit about Vietnam, and talk about just absolute tragedy. And again, this is, I mean, it's during the worst time in modern history, certainly. I mean, the 1960s are unquestionably the worst decade in hundreds of years. I think no one would deny that. I mean, you had the sexual revolution, Vatican II,
Yeah,
Vietnam, and Vietnam is a great example of the men, especially some women, but mostly men, being drafted into the. You're drafted into the military at one point. You're sent to Vietnam to fight a war that most people didn't. What, Vietnam? So you're
yeah,
sent there. You fight, you die, you lose your friends. Let's say you don't die, you come home, and you're hated. Your country, your fellow countrymen hate you because they hate the war, because the war is unjust and ridiculous and stupid. But the soldiers were the ones who paid for it.
yeah,
It wasn't the government. It wasn't Lyndon Johnson or Nixon. It was absolutely the soldiers. And I think this is that disconnect where it's like, wait a second, the soldiers were doing their duty. What are they supposed to do? Especially if you're drafted and then you're sent there and you die, or you come back wounded or whatever. I mean, for goodness sake, that's obviously still heroic, even though the war, it was, of course it was immoral and ridiculous and absurd, but the men were still doing their duty and doing what they had to do. And I would say even those who joined up to go and fight, maybe that's a little more questionable, but
yeah,
still, I mean, you do, when you're in the military, you do your duty, as of course you know. But I think that's a great example of as you say, the corporation sending men to die, but the men still being heroes, even though they're doing it for the corporation.
yeah. And I think you made a very good point there, especially when it comes to the corporation sending our most patriotic men. I just
Hmm.
had an interview for a personal interview with my dad, just like as a family tree. We talked about how after 9/11 we sent our most patriotic men to die. The mentality of men wanting to go defend their nation, that's a good thing. But that's what the corporation essentially brainwashes the true countrymen using the virtue of patriotism and saying, you must go fight. There is an enemy out there. That's true. There is an enemy. And unfortunately, it's all here. We need to convert. We need to repent and turn to God for mercy for honestly the sins of the corporation, and to ask God to have mercy on the true nation, and that he may,
But see,
enshrine.
no, I'm
But
sorry to interrupt you. No, you're exactly right. But I see this is exactly in my mind the heart of the matter. That I feel like a lot of people, they see what happens. They know there is a war going on, and I think they know that, yeah, the corporation, the people at the top are the
yeah,
issue. In our society, our own sins. I mean, obviously, so I think a lot of people, the instinct is kind of like, okay, then I'm done with it. I hate it all. I no, But it's like, well, where's the heroic nature of, there is a war, why aren't we fighting? Why are we just
yeah,
burying our head in the sands and crying? Oh, I hate everything. That's
yeah,
not what Catholic men should do. That's the point. Right? That's exactly why we want to have this show. That's not what we should do. We should go and say, okay, maybe it doesn't mean to sign up for the army, which you did. Nothing wrong with that. Not everyone needs to do that, of course. But
yeah,
what is the fight that we need to fight? And again, that's the point. But we do need to fight for our country, the soul of our country. That's
yeah.
exactly patriotism.
And I totally agree with you on that, because, and that's why I said it before, it's kind of like the political version of Home Alone. You say there's a huge issue, but then you say there's nothing I can do about it. Essentially, like basically, God is letting us have a time when, even though we are called to pray and then act, we're called to first pray, but we have to act. Without that, then it's we're just sitting here as basically sitting ducks waiting for someone to come around and take us out, which again the corporation is very willing to do that. And there's numerous examples of the nation, or the corporation using the most patriotic men to go die, when in reality our fight is here. Our fight is the soul of the nation. And again, think about the perception. Most people who convert to Catholicism are mostly conservative. So imagine we all, as Catholics, just we hate the flag, we hate the nation, and they go and they say, "I've been trying to get away from this with the liberals. I'm trying
Hmm.
to get away from the burning of the flag and everything." Maybe the Catholics aren't burning the flag, but they have that kind of same mentality of that stands for something evil, when it doesn't actually. It stands for the real nation, which is against tyranny. So many Catholics rightfully hate the corporation. they end up associating the corporation with the nation, and that's the big issue. That's why I say the corporation that seeks to enshrine tyranny, those are not our fellow countrymen. Those are infiltrators, just like the modernists infiltrated the church. Those are not our fellow Catholics. But imagine the way the patriotic conservatives, they look at us praying rosaries outside of a abortion clinic, or we have the flag there. We show respect to our nation and to our faith. They might say, those men are doing what men should do. Those men are standing up for the faith. They are trying to convert their nation. They love their nation. They want to see her converted to the Catholic faith, and they want to see her be a true friend of the church. And we may see that one day, but we can't see that if we are out to fight. If we just decide, okay, I'm done. It's bad. It's no redeeming it. We just need to topple the whole thing. Whatever God decides to do, we're not going to pray for it, or we're not, or we may pray for it, but we're not gonna. We don't want the flag. We don't want to show any kind of patriotism. I think that's a huge misstep, and I think that's a huge mistake.
Well, and look at what's going to happen. This is going to happen more in Europe than in the U.S. But in Europe, there are only two groups of people having babies. That's Muslims and conservative Catholics.
Yes.
And so that's it. No one else is having babies, and so it's catastrophic here in Europe. And I think the U.S. is not quite so bad, but still, I
Yeah.
mean, mostly you're going to have that same issue. But I think that the point being, in the future generations, yeah, who's going to fight that fight? And it's going to happen. I can tell you, in Europe for sure, it's going to happen. It's going to happen that you're going to have a Muslim majority, and what then? And especially if we stop having kids, I mean, and then you may actually have to fight for the country you come
Yeah.
from, and that's another interesting point. But it's exactly the point where I think we need to understand that we don't want that. And I hear some of these people who are always Debbie Downers. They're always go, oh yeah, the Muslims are taking over the West and stuff. It's like, yeah, why do you think?
Yeah.
Because good people do nothing. We stand around and we do nothing, and that's
Yeah.
the point. And the Muslims have they're wrong. Obviously, they worship a satanic idol or person or whatever you want to call them,
Yeah.
but they actually have morals and values that they stand for and fight for, and they're spreading them. I mean, shouldn't we kind of think, maybe that's yeah, they got some stuff going right. Certainly not their faith, but man, some of the things they do, we
Yeah.
got to pay attention. They're going to take over.
They're going to win just by sheer numbers,
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
often how the enemy does win.
yep.
And the enemy will use that to basically just by population, they're going to eliminate their enemies. They're going to eliminate us. And I also think it's super important when you're raising young boys to teach them patriotic things, teach them about their fatherland, and then teach them about how the issues and missteps that the founding fathers had because they weren't Catholic. But then we should praise the things that are good, like the Second Amendment or parts of the First Amendment, and then that could instill a deep love for authority and for their fatherland, which they would be willing to fight for through prayers or through going out and telling people and evangelizing. Again, the Catholic faith did flourish here. So later on, I'm going to get into the quotes about Father Gecko. I had a conversation with him when I was seeking to understand the answer of respecting the flag. Basically, can Catholics salute it? Can they love it? Can they support their flag? And then can they look at the flag with essentially love for it? And he said, absolutely, you can. And then he talked about his issues with people who had this mentality. He said that often people who had the mentality of, I hate the flag, or I hate this nation, I want nothing to do with it because of the Freemasonic principles, at one point in their life used to idolize it. They used to think it was the best thing since sliced bread. They used to think this is the new Jerusalem. And then when they convert to the Catholic faith, they realize Freemasons are not good. They're not our friends. And then also they essentially started this nation, and they go, look how bad this is, I want nothing to do with it. Whereas Father Gecko was raised knowing the principles, knowing that these were Freemasonic principles, and knew about the bad, but he also knew about the good, and was raised to love his nation, and to pray for her conversion, but to still show respect to the flag. You can still put your hand over your heart, you can still salute it, you can still show reverence to it, because you're showing reverence to the real nation. Okay, if they change the flag tomorrow and they make it the symbol of Baphomet and the pentagram, that would be your obligation to not show respect to that flag. Only show respect to the true nation. That would be just the symbol of the corporation changing. Instead of pretending to have one symbol, they would full on come out and show who they really work for. Because the corporation is definitely not for God, not for country, not for its people. So again, Americans, I think we also, as Americans, not even Catholics, but definitely as Catholics, we are required to really hate the anti-American corporation because it goes against the Constitution, it goes against freedom, it goes against all of our founding fathers' principles on top of going against the Catholic Church. So I would say that it's an obligation to strongly detest and to fight against that corporation through your prayers and through your devotion, educating your kids that we are not a democracy, that we are a constitutional republic, and that even though they say we're democracy, we're really a communist corporation oligarchy, and that pretends to be a democracy.
Hmm.
So I think that there is a way. Well, before I get into that, let me just say this: just as there's a false church pretending to, and calling itself the Catholic Church, there's also a false America, the corporation, calling itself the nation, using the comparison of Sister Lucy and the Novus Ordo, and there's so many other deceptions out there. But usually, it's not just I found out that they've been putting poison in my food. Therefore, all the food is poison. See, that's the wrong conclusion. I found out that America is doing evil things right now. Therefore, everything in America is evil. That's not true. Somebody has tainted it. Somebody has turned it into something really bad. I think it goes back to the Civil War, a little bit before that. And I think that the mentality was that we need the Union to stay together at all costs, even if we're going to sacrifice our freedoms. And we saw those freedoms get sacrificed in 2020, which again, I know everyone, it's very controversial to talk about, but those are manifestations of the corporation, at work whenever
Well,
they're seeking to take away your rights.
well, and people, I think, they think, well, it can never be changed. It's too long. We're too deep. It's too bad. So does anyone know history? Let's say Roman history.
Yeah,
Constantine. Right before Constantine was one of the greatest Christian persecutions, like 10 years before. So you went from Diocletian to Constantine within 10 years. So I mean,
yep,
in his entire army were pagans. They were pagans, and he converted. And you know what happened? He converted everyone because if the leadership goes, typically people follow. And
yep,
that's that. So, and that happened. Of course, that happened because of the grace that came from the martyrs. I mean, no question about it. The great saints that spilled their blood in Rome, no question that grace earned a government that became Catholic overnight, literally at least that's the story, right? With the cross in the sky. I mean, that can happen. It literally has happened in the past, and I think that's what we have to remember too. That this whole despair, it can change. God can change anything, but
yep,
as you said, of course, first of all, maybe we need martyrs. Maybe that will come to that. Who knows? But especially prayer, sacrifice, and the desire for the good of your country. Again, that's the whole point of the show. And I think before we get into part 3 and 4, we're going to save that for part 2 of this podcast because I'm really determined to keep podcasts at around 45 minutes. I think, again, people, it goes past 45 and people are like, nah, too long. So we're going to keep this as part 1. We'll be back for part 2. Andrew, it's been a pleasure. We'll be back again. I'll see you here in a second. We'll record the second part, but everyone else, we'll publish these probably soon after each other, maybe 1 or 2 days apart, maybe on the same day. We'll figure that out later. But hopefully everyone enjoyed it. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. Let us know what you think. And you can disagree, obviously. If you're determined that you really hate what our country has done, let's talk about it in the comments, because I think that's part of what we want to do too, is have a conversation, as the Novus Ordos would say, a dialogue. Let's dialogue in the comment section, guys. So Andrew, until part 2, I'll see you in a bit. God bless.